Welcome to Hello Dear. My name is Pedro Salinas. Thank you for listening today. I'm doing another solo episode because I was supposed to have a guest on and he canceled. Rescheduled, I should say. He'll be on soon. Don't worry. And it'll be a great conversation. But I didn't want to leave you hanging with no content tomorrow. That would be a cruel thing to do to you, my loyal listeners. So I'm going to do another solo episode where I read from books that have inspired me, changed the way I think about the world. And I'm going to talk about what those passages mean to me. And I'm going to try to do so in a cogent and intelligent and coherent way. I have not done that much preparation. If all things were according to what I wanted, I would have done more. I would have an entire agenda for you. I would have bullet points of what I wanted to say, but I don't have that today. I'm just going to try to talk off the dome as wisely and as compellingly as I can. How am I doing today, first of all? What are my stats? Let's see what my step count is. I bet it's pathetic. I have not done much walking. I did go for a run yesterday. I told you this is the same thing last time I did a solo pod, is that I had gone for a run the day previously and had very few steps. 393 steps. Nice. Better than last time. Last time I think I literally had like a less than 100. So, not ideal, but actually, honestly, it's a pretty humiliating stat. And I'm feeling sick. You might already be able to tell by the fuzzy way in which I'm speaking and the sort of spacey nature of my tone and mood. I'm hoping this is like Michael Jordan's flu game, but it'll probably just be like any other person's flu day where they don't perform very well. But I'm going to push ahead and try anyway. Shout out to Alex, love you. Kate, love you. Edward, don't know you. I don't think we've ever met personally, but you listen and you often DM me nice things about the podcast, so shout out to you. Shout out to, I think your name is Ben. Your Instagram is Ben's Picture Archive. You DM me about this podcast sometimes. Never met you. Appreciate that you listen. Shout out to the other, let's say 35 of you who seem to tune in. Maybe one day it'll be 35,000. Wouldn't that be crazy? We can only dream. And I can only keep doing this in the hopes that the audience grows and that I'm not losing you as I speak. Okay, I'm just going to jump in. So, I'm going to read from two books from the Mars trilogy by Kim Stanley Robinson. This is a sci-fi trilogy of books about the people in the near future who colonize Mars. It starts with 100 people, and it grows, and it becomes a full-on new society. And the trilogy spans about 200 to 300 years, in which a life extension treatment becomes available, and so we stay with the same characters from the very beginning of the series all the way through to the end, and by the end of the series, they're like 300 years old. So it's this incredible, expansive, sweeping account of what it means to build a new society, what it means to have a relationship with a planet. That's a massive theme in these books, is what is Mars? And is it ethical to transform Mars to be more Earth-like so that Earthlings can live on it? That's evident even in the names of the books. The first book is called Red Mars. The second book is called Green Mars. The third book is called Blue Mars. So you can kind of gather from that the planet is becoming more Earth-like as humans live on there longer. Beautiful series of books. The first Kim Stanley Robinson books I read. I've subsequently read a lot more of his work. He's great. How do I describe him? I guess he's a socialist. He's temperamentally pretty moderate, but he gives voice to a ton of very left-wing ideas in his books. He loves cooperative economies. That's something that shows up a lot in his books. He's very academic. He's very research-driven. Sometimes his books are dense and technical, but I do not feel that the dense and technical quality of his writing takes away from the beauty of his ideas or of his prose. I think there's a lyrical quality to his prose that is completely embedded with the academic nature of his interest. So, the first passage that I'm going to read you, and by the way, these are going to be long, okay? I'm going to read you an extensive passage from Red Mars and from Blue Mars, so book 1, book 3 of this trilogy. I'm going to try to dive in as much as I can, as concisely as I can. I'm going to try to summarize the things that you need to know so that you can understand why it is I chose these passages and what I find interesting about them. So, the first passage I'm going to read is from a chapter called Homesick. It's from Red Mars. So, Homesick is from the point of view of Michel, who is the resident psychologist on the initial Mars colony of 100 people. And the whole thrust of Homesick is that Michel is losing his mind. So let's begin. And by the way, Michel is counseling a woman named Maya in this chapter. So it starts with him talking to Maya, and then it kind of expands to his general thoughts.
Back at Underhill, he turned on the shrink program in his head and asked Maya if she was feeling better. And she touched her faceplate to his, giving him a brief glimpse of a gaze that was a kiss. "You know I do," her voice said in his ear. He nodded. "I think I'll go for another walk then," he said, and did not say, "But what about me? What will make me feel better? What will make me feel better?" He willed the movements of his legs and walked off. The bleak plain surrounding the base was a vision out of some post-Holocaust desolation. A nightmare world. Nevertheless, he didn't want to go back into the little warren of artificial light and heated air and carefully deployed colors. Colors that he himself had chosen for the most part, utilizing the very latest in color mood theory, a theory which he now understood to be based on certain root assumptions that did not in fact apply here. The colors were irrelevant. The colors were all wrong, or worse, irrelevant. Wallpaper in hell. The phrase formed in his mind and pushed at his lips. Wallpaper in hell. Wallpaper in hell. Since they're gonna go crazy anyway. Certainly it had been a mistake to have only one psychiatrist along. Every therapist on Earth was also in therapy. It was part of the job. It came with the territory. But his therapist was back in Nice, 15 time-slipped minutes away at best. And Michel talked to him, but he couldn't help. He didn't understand, not really. He lived where it was warm and blue. He could go outside. He was, Michel presumed, in reasonably good mental health. While Michel was a doctor in a hospice in a prison in hell. And the doctor was sick.
I'll pause here. Love that last line. Michel was a doctor in a hospice in a prison in hell. Normally, when you're writing, you try to avoid those kind of repetitive sequences of prepositional phrases. But here it kind of works because what does it do? I don't know. It sort of evokes the feeling that he's trapped, that he's underneath something, that he's encaged by something. It's really scary. It's a really scary passage. And the whole point is that he's from this beautiful part of France, and he feels very connected to the territory, to the landscape, to the beat, to the sea, to the air, to the ocean. And now he's on this desolate planet, and he feels lost.
He hadn't been able to adapt. People were different in that regard. It was a matter of temperament. Maya, walking toward the locked door, had a temperament quite different from his, which somehow enabled her to be completely at home here. To tell the truth, he didn't think she really noticed her surroundings much in any case. And yet, in other ways, he and she were similar. It had to do with the lability-stability index and its particular emotionality. They were both labile, and yet fundamentally, they were very different characters. The labile-stabile index had to be considered in combination with the very different set of characteristics grouped under the labels extroversion and introversion. This had been a great discovery of the recent year, and now it structured all his thinking about himself and his charges.
So now going forward in this chapter, you just start to get a ton of information, a ton of technical, detailed information about extroversion and introversion, lability and stability, which were concepts I'd never heard of before reading this. I think they're real. He starts talking about the different ways that people can be characterized, such qualities as sociability, impulsiveness, changeability, talkativeness, outgoingness, activity, liveliness, excitability, optimism. And then he basically starts to decide to create a new rectangle of personality types that combine extroversion and introversion and lability and stability. And he starts obsessing about this, what he calls semantic rectangle. And I love how this part emerges out of this description of him losing his mind on Mars. That immediately goes into what he's obsessing about with work. And it goes into his feverish diagramming of the mind and what it means and how it works and how to classify people and according to what spectrum and what version of personality type you subscribe to. And just the brilliance of this writing is that it immediately mimics. It's like you're reading an academic paper, but you know that the academic paper is being written by someone who's losing his mind. And I think this is an example of Kim Stanley Robinson's kind of objective, scientific, technical writing being infused with soul and despair in a way that's incredibly evocative and effective. So, the rest of the chapter, Michel's wandering around, obsessing about these rectangles. There's even diagrams in the actual book that are drawn where you kind of see how these four characteristics interact with each other. And what he realizes, Michel, as he's doing all this, is that he has essentially recreated the ancient Greek schema of personality types in which centered around the four humors, which I think the Greeks understood to be literally fluids within your body that, depending on what proportion of each you had, it affected what kind of personality you had. So the four humors and the four personality types are... The four personality types based on the four humors are sanguine, phlegmatic, melancholic, and choleric. And depending on the proportion of fluids that you have, you're one of these four. According to the Greeks, and Michel realizes, I've basically recreated this in my incredibly new arrangement of stability, lability, extroversion, introversion. So he's obsessing about this. He's thinking about what that means. He's also thinking about how much he misses home and how desolate he feels on Mars and how upset and how he wants to die, essentially. And he starts to feel despair about the sequence of events that have brought him to Mars. That he was this ambitious young psychiatrist in France, that he had a great life, and that he felt connected to the earth and to the ocean and to the sky and to the people around him, but he had this desire to go out and to explore unfathomed territory, which was Mars. And now he's here and he's miserable. And not only miserable, he's actually losing his mind. He's having delusions. He's becoming he is losing his stability. So starts wandering around, and he starts kind of having dips in consciousness.
Then he was walking the tunnels out to the garage. The colony psychiatrist, experiencing visions, falling into gaps of consciousness, gaps of memory. Physician, heal thyself. But he couldn't. He had gone insane of homesickness. Homesickness. There must be a better term for that. A scientific label that would legitimize it, make it real to others. But he already knew it was real. He missed Provence so much that at times he felt he could not breathe. He was like Nadia's hand, a part of it torn away, the ghost nerves still throbbing with pain.
Nadia is another character who loses her hand while she's working on machinery on Mars. So then Michel goes wandering, and suddenly a mysterious figure comes to him and beckons him. And so he starts following the mysterious figure, and the figure takes him to what I think is the terrarium of the colony, you know, the place where they're growing plants and fungus and they're trying to, you know, create agriculture on Mars, which is led by a mysterious Japanese woman named Hiroko, who is kind of very spiritual and woo-woo. And suddenly this figure brings Michelle in, and all the people in the terrarium are having some weird sort of ceremony where they're eating dirt. They're eating Martian dirt. And Hiroko offers dirt to Michel and puts it in his hand. Now I'm going to read the end of the chapter, which is going to encompass about a page and a half.
The dirt in his hand was warm and smelled rusty. "This is our body," Hiroko said. She walked to the other side of the circle, gave the children each a fistful of dirt, and sent them back to sit among the adults. She sat across from Michel and began to chant in Japanese. Evgenia leaned over and whispered a translation, or rather an explanation, in his ear. They were celebrating the Ariophany, a ceremony they had created together under Hiroko's guidance and inspiration. It was a kind of landscape religion, a consciousness of Mars as a physical space suffused with kami, which was the spiritual energy or power that rested in the land itself. Kami was manifested most obviously in certain extraordinary objects in the landscape. Stone pillars, isolated ejecta, sheer cliffs, oddly smoothed crater interiors, the broad circular peaks of the great volcanoes. These intensified expressions of Mars's kami had a Terran analog within the colonists themselves, the power that Hiroko called viriditas, that greening, fructiparous power within, which knows that the wild world itself is holy. Kami, viriditas. It was the combination of these sacred powers that would allow humans to exist here in a meaningful way. When Michel heard Evgenia whisper the word combination, all the terms immediately fell into a semantic rectangle. Kami and viriditas, Mars and Earth, hatred and love, absence and yearning. And then the kaleidoscope clicked home, and all the rectangles folded into place in his mind. All antinomies collapsed to a single beautiful rose, the heart of the Ariophany, Kami suffused with viriditas, both fully red and fully green at one and the same time. His jaw was slack, his skin was burning. He could not explain it and did not want to. His blood was fire in his veins. Hiroko stopped chanting, brought her hand to her mouth, began to eat the dirt in her palm. All the others did the same. Michel lifted his hand to his face. A lot of dirt to eat, but he stuck his tongue out and licked up half of it and felt a brief electric shiver as he rubbed it against the roof of his mouth, sliding the gritty stuff back and forth until it was mud. It tasted salty and rusty, with an unpleasant whiff of rotten eggs and chemicals. He choked it down, gagging slightly. He swallowed the other mouthful in his hand. There was an irregular hum coming from the circle of celebrants as they ate, vowel sounds shifting from one to the next. I, oo, ah, e, oo, lingering over each vowel for a minute, it seemed, the sound spreading into two and sometimes 3 parts, with head tones creating odd harmonies. Hiroko began to chant over this song. Everyone stood, and Michelle scrambled up with them. They all moved into the center of the circle together, Evgenia and Ellen taking Michelle by the arms and pulling him along. Then they were all pressed together around Hiroko in a mass of close-packed bodies surrounding Michelle so that warm skin squashed up against every side of him. This is our body. A lot of them were kissing, their eyes closed. Slowly they moved, twisting to keep maximum contact as they shifted to new kinetic configurations. Wiry pubic hair tickled his bottom, and he felt what had to have been an erect penis against his hip. The dirt was heavy in his stomach, and he felt lightheaded. His blood was fire. His skin felt like a taut balloon containing a blaze. The stars were packed overhead in astonishing numbers, and each one had its own color. Green or red or blue or yellow, they looked like sparks. He was a phoenix. Hiroko herself pressed against him, and he rose in the center of the fire, ready for rebirth. She held his new body in a full embrace, squeezed him. She was tall and seemed all muscle. She looked him eye to eye. He felt her breasts against his hips, her pubic bone hard on his thigh. She kissed him, her tongue touching his teeth. He tasted the dirt, then suddenly felt all of her at once. All the rest of his life, the involuntary memory of that feeling would be enough to start the pulse of an erection. But at the moment, he was too overwhelmed, completely aflame. Hiroko pulled her head back and looked at him again. His breath was whooshing in his lungs, in and out. In English, in a voice formal but kind, she said, "This is your initiation into the Areophany, the celebration of the body of Mars. Welcome to it. We worship this world. We intend to make a place for ourselves here. A place that is beautiful in a new Martian way, a way never seen on Earth. We have built a hidden refuge in the south, and now we are leaving for it. We know you. We love you. We know we can use your help. We know you can use our help. We want to build just what you are yearning for, just what you have been missing here, but all in new forms. For we can never go back. We must go forward. We must find our own way. We start tonight. We want you to come with us." Michelle said, "I'll come."
All right. Well, I'm sorry that that passage became incredibly horny. I totally forgot about that. But honestly, it's fucking sick. It's so good. This book is so goddamn fucking good. Oh my god, dude. I mean, everything thematically that happens in the Mars trilogy is contained in those pages that I just read. The thing about Viriditas becomes incredibly important. The thing about mixing earthness and Marsness and redness and greenness and synthesizing them to make a new element and a new color and a new way of life, that happens. That's what takes up the rest of the plot for the next 3 books. And I just love the way this chapter transitions from dense academic technical writing about extroversion, introversion, about stability, lability, and following the thrust of Michelle's psychology, it becomes this completely fucking insane orgy scene. This cult leader, magical kind of passage that's totally nonsensical, totally mystical, but completely explicable through the rules that the book has already set out. And as Michelle finds himself in this new community and finds himself needing it and finds himself becoming a part of it, you feel yourself doing the same because you've been stuck in his repetitive loops of semantic rectangles. But it also, what I like about it doesn't completely undo his semantic rectangles. It keeps that structure of thought in his mind and it adds the mysticism to it. So now he has a new one, right? I mean, he has the new semantic rectangle of Mars and Earth, commune viriditas, hatred and love, absence and yearning. And you have this sense of the numinous, right? Which is an incredibly difficult feeling to evoke in prose and often fails. And here you're using the language of Michel, which is psychological classification and academic, technical language about the mind. These attempts to classify what is probably unclassifiable. And through all that, you get this feeling of God, right? This feeling of the spirit of Mars, this feeling of, eating the dirt. What a crazy fucking thing to do. I love that you get a taste of it, right? That it tastes like rotten eggs and chemicals, and he's sliding the gritty stuff back and forth until it was mud. It's a disgusting scene, and you taste it, right? So that's from Red Mars, and I love that. I think about this chapter all the time. I think about Michel's semantic rectangles all the time. And so then Michel goes off to the south with Hiroko, and they create kind of a commune, and a bunch of other stuff happens in Red Mars, and then there's Green Mars, the middle book, which essentially dramatizes Mars seceding from Earth, right? For Red Mars and Green Mars, Mars is a colony of Earth. And at the end of Green Mars, they finally achieve independence and are now their own entity. Okay, so a huge part of the Mars trilogy is this disagreement between two characters, Sax Russell and Anne, whose last name I forget. Sax they're both scientists, obviously. Sax is pro-terraforming. Sax's whole thing is, what else are we going to do? We're here now. We have to transform this planet and make it livable for us. We have to give it an atmosphere. We have to establish agriculture. We have to make this a place where humanity can actually live, not just in these weird little habitats and these dome cities, but we have to make this place breathable. That's Sax's point of view. Anne's point of view is, fuck no. There is something holy and mystical about Mars as it was before humanity ever got there. And there's all these... and Anne is she's a tough hang, even as to read about. It's just her hanging out with rocks and observing the rocks and thinking about the things that happened to the rocks millions of years ago and billions of years ago. And there's all these scenes of the, asteroids colliding into Mars's surface and what crater was formed by what impact and things that are cool to think about, but there's so much technical geological language in it that it does kind of become hard to get through. But I think that's part of the book's appeal to me, actually, is that you have to suffer through those patches a little bit, because I think it evokes the inaccessibility of Anne's consciousness. What is it like to be here? What is it like to look at a rock and know so much about it that you actually have feelings about preserving it? So Anne wants to preserve the primal Martian landscape. And it's doomed. She's not going to be able to do that, right? There's humans. It starts with 100, becomes 100,000, becomes millions. Of course they're going to transform the planet. Of course they're going to make it into its own thing. So, Blue Mars, Anne is depressed, okay? Anne is everyone's worried about Anne. They're not sure what to do about her. So this is a chapter called Areophany, which is a word that you just heard a lot in this reading from Red Mars. There's a chapter in Blue Mars where Sax and Michel are talking about Anne. And they're worried about her. They're talking about what to do. Okay.
Then Sax went to Michel. I'm worried about Anne. They were in a corner of the big warehouse on East Pavonis, and the movement and clangor of the crowd created a kind of privacy. But after a look around, Michel said, "Let's go outside." They suited up and went out. East Pavonis was a maze of tents, warehouses, manufactories, pistes, parking lots, pipelines, holding tanks, holding yards. Also junkyards and scrap heaps. Their mechanical detritus scattered about like volcanic ejecta. But Michel led Sax westward through the mess and they came quickly to the caldera rim, where the human clutter was put into a new and larger context, a logarithmic shift that left the pharaonic collection of artifacts suddenly looking like a patch of bacterial growth. At the very edge of the rim, the blackish speckled basalt cracked down in several concentric ledges, each lower than the last. A set of staircases led down these terraces, and the lowest was railed. Michel led Sax down this terrace, where they could look over the side into the caldera, straight down for 5 kilometers. The caldera's large diameter made it seem less deep than that. Still, it was an entire round country down there, far, far below. And when Sax remembered how small the caldera was proportional to the volcano entire, Pavonis itself seemed to bulk under them like a conical continent, rearing right up out of the planet's atmosphere into low space. Indeed, the sky was only purple around the horizon and blackish overhead, with the sun a hard gold coin in the west, casting clean slantwise shadows. They could see it all. The finds thrown up by the explosions were gone. Everything returned to its normal telescopic clarity. Stone and sky, nothing more, except for a thread of buildings cast around the rim. Stone and sky and sun. Ands, Mars. Except for the buildings. And on Ascreus and Arsha and Elysium and even on Olympus, the buildings would not be there. We could easily declare everything above about 8 kilometers a primal wilderness zone, Sax said. Keep it like this forever. Bacteria? Michel asked. Lichen? Probably. But do they matter? To Anne they do. But why, Michel? Why is she like that? Michel shrugged. After a long pause, he said, no doubt it is complex, but I think it is a denial of life, a turning to rock as something she could trust. She was mistreated as a girl. Did you know that? Sax shook his head. He tried to imagine what that meant. Michel said, her father died. Her mother married her stepfather when she was 8. From then on, he mistreated her until she was 16 when she moved to the mother's sister. I've asked her what the mistreatment consisted of, but she says she doesn't want to talk about it. Abuse is abuse, she said. She doesn't remember much anyway, she says. I believe that. Michel waggled a gloved hand. We remember more than we think we do. More than we want to sometimes. They stood there looking into the caldera. It's hard to believe, Sax said. Michel looked glum. Is it? There were 50 women in the first 100. Odds are more than one of them were abused by men in their lives. More like 10 or 15, if the statistics are to be believed. Sexually violated, struck, mistreated. That's just the way it was. It's hard to believe. Yes. Sax recalled hitting Phyllis in the jaw, knocking her senseless with a single blow. There had been a certain satisfaction in that. He had needed to do it, though. Or so it had felt at the time. I'm going to pause here. Sax recalled hitting Phyllis in the jaw. This is from Green Mars. Sax gets kidnapped at one point, I believe by a group that is loyal to Earth, and he gets kidnapped and they torture him until he loses his ability to speak. So for a while he has aphasia and can't talk, and then he slowly regains it. But to get out of that, at one point he hits one of his captors in the jaw, who is Phyllis. Okay. Everyone has their reasons, Michel said, stalling him. Or so they think. He tried to explain, tried in his usual Michel fashion to make it something other than plain evil. At the base of human culture, he said as he looked down into the country of the caldera, is a neurotic response to people's earliest psychic wounds. Before birth and during infancy, people exist in a narcissistic oceanic bliss, in which the individual is the universe. Then sometime in late infancy, we come to the awareness that we are separate individuals, different from our mother and everyone else. This is a blow from which we never completely recover. There are several neurotic strategies used to try to deal with this. First, merging back into the mother. Then denying the mother and shifting our ego ideal to the father. This strategy often lasts forever, and the people of that culture worship their king and their father god, and so on. Or the ego ideal might shift again, to abstract ideas or to the brotherhood of men. There are names and full descriptions for all these complexes. the Dionysian, the Persian, the Apollonian, the Heraclean. They all exist, and they are all neurotic in that they lead to misogyny except for the Dionysian complex. This is one of your semantic rectangles, Sachs asked apprehensively. Yes. The Apollonian and Heraclean complexes might describe Terran industrial societies. The Persian, its earlier cultures, with strong remnants, of course, right up to this day. And they are all three patriarchal. They all denied the maternal, which was connected in patriarchy with the body and with nature. The feminine was instinct, the body, and nature, while the masculine was reason, mind, and law ruled. Sachs, fascinated by so much throwing together, said only, and on Mars? Well, on Mars it may be that the ego ideal is shifting back to the maternal, to the Dionysian again, or to some kind of post-Oedipal reintegration with nature, which we are still in the process of inventing. Some new complex that would not be so subject to neurotic overinvestment. Sachs shook his head. It was amazing how floridly elaborate a pseudoscience could get. A compensation technique, perhaps, a desperate attempt to be more like physics. But what they did not understand was that physics, while admittedly complicated, was always trying very hard to become simpler.
Okay, so I've been reading for a while, so I should give you some analysis. Because I'm starting to feel like I'm wasting your time, but I'm going to push through that insecurity and keep going. So it starts with them in the city, East Pavonis. Then Michelle goes, let's go outside. Okay. And then you get this passage of what Kim Stanley Robinson is really good at, which is descriptions of Martian geology. The caldera's large diameter, Pavonis itself seemed to bulk under them like a conical continent. You get this beautiful description of the sky. The sky was only purple around the horizon and blackish overhead, with the sun a hard gold coin in the west. You get this intense physical description. You're on Mars. You feel like you're on Mars. You're kind of struggling to even understand the profluence of descriptions of rocks. And then you get, they were on Anne's Mars. Stone and sky and sun, Anne's Mars. I love that too. I love how he goes from incredibly granular technical language to stone and sky and sun. This very kind of biblical, archetypal, totemic language. Anne's Mars. This Mars that doesn't have human concepts attached to it. That doesn't have these ideas about the Apollonian and the Heraclean and these things about the dad and the mom and these human anxieties attached to it. None of it's there. Anne's Mars. Empty. So then, yeah, we get this description of Sachs and Michelle talking about why is she like this? Why is she so fucking obsessed with rocks? What's wrong with her? And Michelle goes on, and he goes on at length, which I love. I kind of love reading, actually. I love reading Michelle's. I mean, I just read an entire chapter to you of Michelle's psychobabble. I'm attracted to that. I find that stuff to be fun and interesting to read, even if I don't agree with it, and even if I don't find it to be accurate. And he's essentially describing all of human civilization as plagued by these insecurities about the separation of birth and the trauma of no longer being a part of your mother. And he describes every kind of society we've seen as just simplified some way of dealing with it. Industrial society is upholding laws which are seen as masculine and rejecting nature, which is seen as feminine. And he just kind of waves his arm and describes it all that way. And he attaches Anne's trauma with her stepfather to it. So he says, okay, well, because she's so disgusted by the way she was treated by her stepfather, she has retreated to this world of rock, this empty, inhuman landscape that is a denial of life. But Sachs is skeptical. And Sachs's skepticism leads to this paragraph, which is my favorite in the entire trilogy. Okay.
Sachs shook his head. Astounding, really, that Michel could consider psychology any kind of science at all. So much of it consisted of throwing together, of thinking of the mind as a steam engine, the mechanical analogy most ready to hand during the birth of modern psychology. People had always done that when they thought about the mind. Clockwork for Descartes, geological changes for the early Victorians, computers or holography for the 20th century, AIs for the 21st, and for the Freudian traditionalists, steam engines. Application of heat, pressure buildup, pressure displacement, venting, all shifted into repression, sublimation, the return of the repressed. Sachs thought it unlikely steam engines were an adequate model for the human mind. The mind was more like, what? An ecology, a fell field, or else a jungle, populated by all manner of strange beasts. Or a universe, filled with stars and quasars and black holes. Well, a bit grandiose, that. Really, it was more like a complex collection of synapses and axons, chemical energies surging hither and yon, like weather in an atmosphere. That was better. Weather. Storm fronts of thought, high pressure zones, low pressure cells, hurricanes. The jet streams of biological desires, always making the swift, powerful rounds. Life in the wind. Well, throwing together. In fact, the mind was poorly understood.
So on a prose level, what I like about this is it really effectively takes us along the rush of Sachs's thought. We truly are observing his consciousness in a minute, second to second, impressionistic way. The way it goes, well, a bit grandiose that. Really, it was more like a complex collection of synapses and axons, chemical energies surging hither and yon, like weather and atmosphere. That was better, weather. So you get this sentence where he kind of reduces the brain all to just, these just fucking chemical reactions. It's axons, synapses, just energies moving around. And then just kind of as an afterthought, he says, like weather. And then he goes, oh, weather. That's actually a good one. And then he follows the point of view of weather. And he goes, yeah, high pressure fronts and low pressure cells, hurricanes, the jet streams of biological desires, et cetera, et cetera. He gets very poetic with it. And then he gives up and he goes, well, I don't know. It's all just throwing together, which is what throwing together is something that comes up a lot in the book. As I recall, because I haven't read these full books in a long time, Sachs describes the meaning of thought making, the process of making thought as throwing together. You take words and concepts and you just put them together and see if they make something new. And it ends with, in fact, the mind was poorly understood. So you get all of this history of how we've thought about the mind. You get steam engines, holography, AIs, etc. And then you just come to this conclusion that actually we don't really know. And this whole thought process emerges out of the specific thing that happened to Sachs, which is that he lost the ability to speak. And so now he is relearning how to speak, and he's relearning how to attach words to concepts. And he's finding that those words do not apply, which is his frustration with psychology. Because psychology is all about attaching words to concepts that are poorly understood. They're not physical, empirically demonstrable things like physics, like chemistry. It's actually hard to prove that something is going on in the mind. You only have the subjective point of view of the person who it's happening to, and you maybe have their behavior, but you can't actually access their consciousness. You can't actually say, this is because of his dad, this is because of his mom. You're just making shit up. And Sachs hears this and feels incredibly frustrated by it. Which I don't think is the novel discounting what Michel's saying. Because, of course, the novel is interested in human psychology because it's a novel. And novels are, the reason they're interesting to us, the reason we read them is because we want to know what it's like to be someone else. And I suppose the novel's process of doing that is by dramatizing and by actually recreating situations instead of analyzing them the way psychology does. But it takes seriously the attempt to do so, which is why Michel's a character. And I just think about this all the time. I think about this passage all the time, and I think about this in my life all the time, that how difficult it is to actually characterize what is going on in my mind and what is going on in other people's mind, and the limited tools we have at our disposal to do so, the limited tools we have to understand each other. And I find that, I guess, at once beautiful and sad. Okay, I'm gonna do one last reading, and then I'm gonna get the fuck out of here. Thank you for listening, by the way. I know this isn't my greatest work, but I'm publishing it. It's there. There's going to be a fucking new podcast tomorrow because I take you seriously, my beautiful listener, and I don't want you to have to go a week without listening to me talk. How sad would that be for you? Okay, this is a poem by Jorge Luis Borges. It's from a collection called Poems of the Night. It is called Mirrors.
I have been horrified before all mirrors, not just before the impenetrable glass, the end and the beginning of that space, inhabited by nothing but reflections, but faced with specular water, mirroring the other blue within its bottomless sky, incised at times by the illusory flight of inverted birds, or troubled by a ripple, or face to face with the unspeaking surface of ghostly ebony, whose very hardness reflects, as within a dream, the whiteness of spectral marble or a spectral rose. Now, after so many troubling years of wandering beneath that wavering moon, I ask myself what accident of fortune handed to me this terror of all mirrors. Mirrors of metal and the shrouded mirror of sheer mahogany, which in the twilight of its uncertain red softens the face that watches and is in turn watched by it. I look on them as infinite, elemental fulfillers of a very ancient pact to multiply the world, as in the act of generation, sleepless and dangerous. They extenuate this vain and dubious world within the web of their own vertigo. Sometimes at evening they are clouded over by someone's breath, someone who is not dead. The glass is watching us. And if a mirror hangs somewhere on the four walls of my room, I am not alone. There's another. A reflection which in the dawn enacts its own dumb show. Everything happens, nothing is remembered, in those dimensioned cabinets of glass in which, like rabbis in fantastic stories, we read the lines of text from right to left. Claudius, king for an evening, king in a dream, did not know he was a dream until that day on which an actor mimed his felony with silent artifice in a tableau. Strange that there are dreams, that there are mirrors. Strange that the ordinary, worn-out ways of every day encompass the imagined and endless universe woven by reflections. God, I've begun to think, implants a promise in all that insubstantial architecture that makes light out of the impervious surface of glass and makes the shadow out of dreams. God has created nights well populated with dreams, crowded with mirror images, so that man may feel that he is nothing more than vain reflection. That's what frightens us.
I just think this is a banger of an opening line. I have been horrified before all mirrors. I love that. Love that. And I love this, the sequence of mirrors that he describes, that every reflective surface freaks him the fuck out. And this idea that there's a double watching him, and that there's this weird elemental pact, elemental fulfillers of a very ancient pact to multiply the world. I just love the terror that permeates this whole poem. And this is something that Borges is really good at, which is taking some, like a, I don't know, kind of an obvious phenomenon, which is the reflection of someone, and intensifying it and investigating it and making it to be something kind of cosmic and mysterious and confusing and deep. Strange that there are dreams, that there are mirrors. I love that line too. And I guess the whole point is that man isn't really man. He reflects a truth that is deeper than him and that he can't really understand. And that's what scares us about reflections. I suppose that's what's animating the fear. Okay, my brain feels like jelly. If you're still listening, God bless you. The next time I do this, I will probably try to prepare more. That'd be a good idea. But, this was an experiment again. And at the very least, I got to spend some time with you, and I got to spend some time reading some books I like. So thank you so much for listening. We'll be back next week with a guest, so don't worry. I won't be yapping by myself again, though I will probably do this again at some point. But again, I'm going to come better prepared. Okay, thank you so much.